Hello, and you're very welcome to episode 84 of The Fifth Court, a podcast on legal affairs, presented by myself, Peter Leonard, barrister and mediator.
Myself, Mark Tottenham, barrister and trust and estate practitioner.
Mark, how are you? Good to see you as always. And last week, you will recall, we took a look at the problems which have emerged in relation to the new legislation to do with enduring powers of attorney, and I suppose a campaign that's been run currently to try and do something about it, because it seems like it's a mess. We were joined by an old friend of the show, Flor McCarthy, solicitor from Clonakilty, and who is the founder of Solicitors Growth, and by barrister David Byrne's very interesting contribution, and gave a kind of a personal contribution in relation to this. Got a big response to that.
Definitely, yeah. And I think quite a lot of people signed the petition as a result. And I think just people need to be aware of the difficulties in this area, because it's so important. Anybody who's got elderly parents, elderly relatives needs to be aware of all of the issues that could be coming down the line if and the purpose of EPAs and advanced healthcare directives is to try and give some kind of comfort to
and
people.
Normally kind of new initiatives that come in are progressive, and they sort of add to the body of, whatever is existing out there and improve things. This seems like it's causing a little bit of hassle.
I think one of the problems here is this effectively compulsory registration of enduring powers of attorney, which I don't really see the necessity for myself. It seems like a little bit of excessive bureaucracy.
Okay. All right. Well, look, the two lads made a very strong case in relation to that. Well, tonight we are going to look at the law of kind of landlord and developers and builders and all that, and we're going to be joined by Martin Cooney, who's a partner in Byrne Wallace Solicitors, who believes that developers and landlords get a bit of bad press, and that actually they're kind of important, and that the law sometimes can hinder development, and maybe that's not a good thing. So it's a slightly different take on this area.
The issue is that very often the press just doesn't cover these issues in such a way that you understand that what is affecting development. And I mean, we're all aware that there's a housing shortage.
Yeah. No, Martin has a lot of interesting takes on this, so really looking forward to that interview. But first to three cases that you've identified from the Decisis website. First, we go to an environmental case concerning the grant of a revised industrial emissions license, I should say, for a cement plant. This is the case of Hayes versus the Environmental Protection Agency, and it's a Court of Appeal decision from Ms. Justice Butler.
So a grant had been given in this case by the Environmental Protection Agency, and it was an industrial emissions license for a cement plant. And there had been a challenge by two appellants who lived nearby, who wanted to, who JR'd or judicial review proceedings. And it was rejected in the High Court, and the Court of Appeal upheld that decision, effectively saying that the Environmental Protection Agency had properly exercised its discretion in granting the license, and that all of the correct conditions had been complied with.
Great. Okay. Next to a wardship case, and an Alzheimer's patient was discharged from wardship, permitting her granddaughter to become a co-decision maker. This sounds like a very positive outcome. This is re EK, a ward of court, and it's a decision of Mr. Justice Heslin, the High Court.
Yes, so this arises from this new assisted decision-making legislation. Up until recently, if somebody lost capacity and they didn't have an enduring power of attorney, they were admitted to wardship if decisions needed to be made about their property. In this case, a woman, 98 years old, I think she was, 96, born in 1928. She had been a ward of court, but still had sufficient capacity that once her granddaughter agreed to be her co-decision maker, then she could be released from wardship. There's a whole issue there that I think they described it as complex relationships with her own children, but the granddaughter she was close to, and so
she was a generation mark.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. So no, that's good news. Okay. Finally, another wardship case. This concerned a vulnerable elderly man's care orders. There had been allegations made by the man's son about the nursing home he was staying in, etc. And this is the case of FK, a ward of court, and this is also a decision of Mr. Justice Heslin.
Yes. So again, when you're admitted to wardship, there are issues concerning both the property and the person of the ward. And in this case, the son of the ward, the elderly man involved, was concerned about the care being given in the nursing home, but the judge examined the circumstances and was satisfied that it was appropriate to continue the residential care orders that were in place.
Okay, Mark, 3 great cases there. So we're back shortly with Martin Cooney.
Silence in the Fifth Court.
So we are delighted to be joined in the studio today by Martin Cooney, who is a solicitor with Byrne Wallace. And we're going to discuss with him how the impact of legislative changes and the law in general on development, the availability of housing and all that kind of thing. But maybe, Martin, you could start, just tell us, did you always want to be a lawyer, or had you other ambitions as a child?
Yeah, that's a funny one. I was just discussing this recently with my wife, and we were talking about our kids and what they wanted to be. And I was saying, well, when I was 7, I wanted to be a pilot. But I was probably watching too much Top Gun at the time, right, and dissuaded from the fact then when I figured out we didn't have any jets or fighter planes in the Defence Forces. But I think the writing was on the wall when I was about 12, and I drafted a contract between my mother and I for payment in respect to chores. And I'm not joking. I actually drafted up. Yeah, wow. I drafted up a contract at 12.
Very far-sighted.
Yeah. I was worried she wouldn't stick to her.
Did you get it witnessed?
Yeah.
What was the rate? Were you getting minimum wage or whatever?
I can't, £2 or something for
that was
doing
decent. So that was decent. Yeah.
So commercial as well.
Yeah. Night of business. That's fantastic, Martin. And where are you from? Do you mind me asking?
From Galway.
Galway, okay.
Yeah. So.
And did you have a career before being a lawyer?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
So I suppose to explain the Defence Forces point.
Yes, that's I thought you were Defence Forces.
LinkedIn did leak the fact that you had a Defence Forces involvement.
And I'm still in the Reserve Defence Forces in the Army Reserve. What happened was I had planned originally to go and become an officer in the Defence Forces, and I joined what was at the time the FCA on Force Cussin Áitiúil, which ultimately became the Reserve. And my plan was get some experience there. It was a tried and tested method of you do it, you get additional points on your application. And then in the late 90s, they started changing the mechanism for bringing people into the cadet school, and they were giving you more points for being a college graduate. Because if you don't go in as a college graduate, they send you to college, but they lose their officers for 3 years or 4 years for a degree. So I by the time I had finished university, I had 10 years in the Reserve done, and I used to do about 6 weeks every summer. And I kind of figured I wanted to do the law because I'd done law through college, and I decided, you know what, I'd rather just do it as my hobby or my part-time. And then I went off and took the legal track. But I'm still in it.
Does that mean you still have to train every year?
Yeah. So I train... I'm actually in a transport unit. I'm in the transport school in the Defence Forces Training Centre, but I've actually spent the last year working under the Director of Human Resources drafting administrative instructions, which are like a lower form of legislation within the Defence Forces.
So they're using your legal skills as well.
Yeah.
So the practice you had at the age of 12 is still really useful.
Yeah, it is.
But go back to the FCA, and I mean, I love this. I mean, I did a postgrad in Galway many moons ago, and we had all the cadets in UCG, and I tell you, they had a ball. They were down in, was it Liam Mellow's barracks? Is that it? Down in Renmore? USAC. Yeah. And God, they were living the dream, I have to say, because they were all getting paid while the rest of us were scratching around for a few bob, for a few pints.
Well paid.
But no, it was wonderful. But the FCA, what's the appeal of that?
Well, at the time, I suppose I had a brother who was an officer, so I kind of followed in his footsteps. I was always interested in it. I liked I was in the Scouts. I played team sports. I liked the organisation. I liked the structure. I liked the activity. So the FCA was a way of getting into it without having to fully commit to it. And at the time, I know it was, it was the butt of many jokes as I went along. But like I would have said, it was a very good organisation for young people to go into because it taught you discipline. It taught you organisational skills. It looked after you as well. So when I was in university, my unit realised that I had a lot of time. So they'd nominate me for things so that during the summer, I'd go up and I'd be on full paid training. They fed me, they housed me, they taught me skills. And so prime example is when I went into Arthur Cox, I remember one of the partners saying to me, brought me for lunch when I was a trainee and said, I'm a partner. I've 10 people responsible to me. blah, 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 blah. And I said, well, she asked, what are you in the reserve? And I said, well, I'm about to be commissioned, but I'm currently a company sergeant. And she said, what does that mean? And I said, well, I'm responsible for about 107 people. And when we're mobilised, I'm responsible for their eating, sleeping, drinking, duties, discipline, everything. I'm the utmost senior operational person in the unit. And that was at about 24 or 25. So
when I heard you saying there that, you know, the military life is good for people, I thought you were unleashing your inner Rishi Sunak. Wasn't he trying to bring in military service or national service, compulsory national service? But I can imagine. Wow, what experience. And I mean, great. All right, the law, Mark. We'd better talk to you about the law. That's where we brought him in.
So, you've worked in the past, obviously, for, as you were saying, for Arthur Cox, and you worked for NAMA as well. And a bit of background, we were both speaking at the same conference, the Society of Construction Law Conference, and you were talking about the impact of legislative change and prospective legislative change on decisions being made by big developers, big landlords. And I suppose it's just something that I think, you know, many people, when they're looking at when they're reading the papers or whatever, the big landlords, the big developers, or even the small landlords are portrayed very often as the bad guys. And I think it's sometimes worth just looking at somebody with your experience advising people like that, how investment decisions are made within that framework. So I suppose what I was wondering is, when you're advising at the moment a developer, you know, we've seen a bit of a downturn in commercial property. We've also seen big shortages in housing. What kind of legislative changes, what in the law is obstructing the investment in what this country needs? Okay,
so just to set the context, the housing market in Ireland is completely dysfunctional at the moment. Yeah. And if the government wasn't here, the market would have collapsed a long time ago. Okay, so the government is propping up the housing market for a start. Now, commercial property was absolutely booming before 2020. We were seeing an awful lot of PRS deals, which we call buy to rent or build to rent in the UK, private rental sector, we'd call it here. So that's where institutional investors come in and will invest in a new block of apartments and so on. So that PRS was booming. Hotels were definitely on the up. Data centers, huge amount of work around data centers. And I'm naming these because these have all subsequently, well, apart from hotels, but they've been maligned, and I think unfairly so. And I'm not saying that because they're my clients. I'll give my reasons why in a minute. Commercial office space was again was on the up, so we were seeing an upswing on that, and that was all going well. Housing completely dysfunctional in my view, and then we had COVID, and then COVID changed the dynamic of everything. Now, what's been holding us up all along depends on what you're looking at, but by and large, planning, we all know, is the biggest issue. So planning, when you do a risk register with a client and they do it, but we'd look at it as well, like planning is always your number one risk. And it's just whether you'll get it, how many objections you'll have, how many appeals you'll have if you're not going through one of the strategic developments, judicial review, and how long that's going to impact you. And then how that impacts your investment in terms of your return over the years and the interest, how you view interest rates and so on. A second big issue we've seen happening are utilities. The creation of utilities. So here's our legislation, the creation of a utility like Uisce Éireann, which you might say, well, this is good, it's in the national interest. But the creation of a utility and the time it takes for it to bed down, the time it takes for it to establish itself and its operating procedures and settle down, all has an impact on the end user. Because if it's only starting as an organization and trying to find its feet, that's inevitably going to have delays. And
is this a legal issue, more of a practical issue? Just the fact of dealing with an organisation that's still finding its feet.
Yeah, that's a practical issue, but it's from something that's, I suppose, established as a legal entity by legislation. So you have to see what's coming down the line and how that's going to play, because we then have to reflect it into the contractual arrangement and the risk matrix. So whilst it is, we couldn't really foresee the practical issues, we can see the legal issue in a new entity being created and whether or not that's a risk event for reflection in the contract.
Because, and can I just take you back to the planning issue? Because you get the impression sometimes that there's objections to almost every development. Yeah. I mean, is this something that you're just aware is likely to happen, or does it happen very regularly with almost every development you're dealing with?
Nearly every development we deal with, we'd have objections of some kind. So stakeholder engagement.
And are they necessarily objections, or are they just sort of local observations that might be taken into account by the planning officers?
It depends. So people have different motivations, and there are people who are genuinely interested in good sustainable development, environmental issues, and otherwise. I have a case where objections were being raised because the locals saw a sum of money in the pricing, which was there for local benefit, and essentially sought to leverage that for their own benefit rather than having community parks and swings and slides for their children. So, you're looking at positions like that. So it depends. You've got people who have genuine interest, and then you have people who will see.
What about that? It's become very controversial. And I mean, I'm sure it's been going on for a long time. This notion of kickbacks, the objectors who suddenly go away when the developer meets with them and comes to some sort of resolution. I think we all know what we're talking about here. I mean, how real is that over the years, Martin? Or can you talk about that?
No, to be honest, we wouldn't really have knowledge of that, because that's something that's done between the developers. But I suppose you have to distinguish between points where there's a genuine engagement between a developer and the locals. And I'll give you an example, wind farms. Wind farm developers will engage with locals, and they'll agree to put money into a community fund. Or they'll put money into, or they'll agree that they'll upgrade your houses. There's nothing nefarious about that. That's just engaging with your stakeholders and dealing with them. There's a Swedish offshore wind farm development in Donegal. Now, this is public. It's in the Irish Times, where they engaged with the local fishermen and the local hospitality. And we did provide them initial advice on this, and they've agreed to set up an SPV where those interest groups have shares in it, and all the shares they get will go back to community benefit. So there's nothing wrong with that. Now, do I know that developers have paid off people to go away? Absolutely. That's a fact of life. We wouldn't really see it, but it generally comes out when a court case is brought or there's a dispute later on and you figure it out. We'd be very naive to sit here and say that it didn't happen. Yes. But of course it's happened.
I mean, it goes back to old God's time. The developers have, I mean, if you look at the football fields around Dublin to a certain extent, people got planning permission. Even in the good old days when Section 4 applied in the local authorities, councillors, generally there was a trade-off, to allow people build, you had to give something back to the community. I think that's a good thing. But when you say, and it's very interesting, and it's very interesting to get their perspective from the developer, Martin. I think that's so important that we get that. But just when you're saying you sit down with your clients, they want to build something. They're motivated by many reasons. It's not just profit. I know profit is probably the primary reason, but to build something and make a contribution, that's their way of life. That's what they do. That's their thing. But they want to build the estate. They want to build the structure. And you say there's always going to be appeals. Are appeals not good things? Are they not in society's interest?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I suppose, and you're very right, Peter, that is exactly it. There's different motivations for different developers. So I worked with one developer whose dream was to put a bridge across a certain river in Ireland. Right, that was their dream because they wanted it to stand there.
I can understand that, absolutely.
I've spoken to another large institutional investor, and their model is they want you to live with them when you're in university. You move on to their apartments when you come out of university. You move on to their houses when you finish up with your, when you move on to your nuclear family.
Almost cradle to grave.
And you go into your retirement home with them. And they don't want to fleece you. They want to keep you with them the whole way, and everyone's happy, right? So there's different motivations. So I think appeals are a good thing, but I think it's absolutely ridiculous that someone in the southeast of the country can object to a data centre in Athenry in County Galway. And in the same period of time that Apple were building or planning to build a data centre in Athenry in Ireland, they were in Galway in Ireland. They were in, I can't remember which country in Scandinavia, but they had it built. They had planning permission and it constructed and operational by the time we were coming to the end of the objection.
But isn't that the issue, Martin? That, I mean, whatever about objections, and of course there will be genuine objections, and then there'll be objections that are less solid, one would have thought. And, there are contrarians out there, and contrarians can stop things that are kind of important more generally for society. I accept that. But isn't the problem the lack of speed in the process? That's it. I mean, if somebody objects, let them object. Let's make a decision. Let's move on. Yeah, and let's have a process that moves much more quickly. Agreed. Isn't that the issue?
That's it. Yeah, and that's what they're planning to do with the Planning and Development Bill. So that's that's one of the things, is to streamline the processes, to speed up the decisions on JR. They're going to restrict I think they should have gone further, or they should go further, but they're going to restrict who can make objections. So if you're a residents association, you must meet certain criteria. You can't be just made up ad hoc. But that's one of the things. They want faster decisions in terms of it. And also they're going to amend the position on JR with it, or this is the proposal, that you won't be able to amend your grounds after the fact. Whatever you go with, that's it. You get one shot. You can't amend it and keep going again. And you also must have exhausted the mechanisms below that, the appeals process, to try and get through it. So these are all laudable. These are things we want to happen and should happen.
And so then you were talking about effectively your checklist with your new development. You've got your planning, you've got your utilities. What are the other legal sort of issues that are likely to concern you? Yeah,
so it changes as time. So there's practical issues, and there's obviously then the legislative issues. So look, to give you an example, we had a big change in building control in 2014, where we brought in the new system, the building control management system. We have statutory appointments, assigned certifiers, builders, and so on. And at that point in time, we were saying this was a risk, that because if you don't follow the certification process, and if you don't submit the documentation correctly onto the register at the end, you can't occupy the building, and it's an offence. So at that point in time, to give you an example, we were saying this is a risk because we don't know how it's going to operate. It's all new. If you don't get it registered, you can't go into your building, and so on and so forth. Now, it's turned out it's fine.
It has actually operated okay.
It's operating okay, but it's operating okay because it's a plaster on a cut that, in my view, it's just. We had a paper certification system, and we've replaced it with a paper certification system. So, but just way more roles.
But are you saying then that you think there might be problems with buildings that have been certified, but the problem is still there? I mean, like the Dunamede situation, where you basically have effectively to strip out an entire building because of lack of fire safety.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be as bad, but I read somewhere that defects in Celtic Tiger houses were at something like 80% of units, or 80% of buildings. What we're seeing now in inspection under this regime is at 12% across the country. 12%.
So the standards are much higher currently.
Standards are higher,
yeah,
but the inspection regime by local authorities is only 12% of everything that's going up. Now,
so they're not being inspected? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'll talk you through the process now. But Dublin is inspecting 80%. So Dublin is putting the resources into it and is checking it. So the regulations move. So that you've got the building control regulations and you have the building regulations. So the building regulations say this is how you must build a building. This is the standard it must reach. The building control is the process that enforces that. And under the building control now, you must appoint a number of statutory duties. And one of them is the assigned certifier. So the assigned certifier has to be either an architect, an engineer, or a building surveyor. They are appointed by the developer or the building owner, and they must inspect the building as it progresses under an inspection plan. And at the beginning, they give an undertaking which they sign that they'll do that. And at the end, they sign a certificate of compliance on completion with the builder that it has been built in substantial compliance with all the plans and the regs and everything. And that's submitted to the Building Control Authority. Now, the assigned certifiers don't work for the state. They could be your architect, and they will carry out your inspections and do that. So when I talk about inspections, I'm talking about the state, the Building Control Authority coming in. Yeah.
So this kind of state audit on top of the 100%, certification.
Exactly. So I think definitely there is an inspection regime there, which is much better. The standards are much better. But we did have a paper certification regime with independent professionals before that.
Okay, so let's go back to the stage before that, which is the independent professional assessments and verification that's in place, i.e. your engineers, your architects. I mean, are they standing up? Are those kind of people who are obviously employed by the builder and the developer to approve things? Are their assessments standing up? Are they, when the state goes in and reviews their work and reviews their approval, so to speak, are they standing up?
Yeah, I think it depends on how sophisticated your project is. So if you're dealing with large scale, sophisticated tier 1 builders, large developers, they are standing up. And I was involved in one large scheme where the assigned certifier was saying, absolutely, this does not comply with building regulations. I am not, you need to deal with the following. And in that instance, the Building Control Authority came in and backed it up and actually brought an enforcement order against the relevant development.
Very good. Okay.
Yeah, so it did. As you go down through the levels and the tiers, that's where I think abuse can happen, because you're dealing with local people who know each other. There's more propensity.
Do you mean smaller scale developments?
Smaller scale developments, yeah. And I'm not saying that it happens. I come from the background of having seen this, and I've seen instances, and I'm laughing because it's so incredible, where architects have signed off on the construction of a building to draw down loans, and the building does not exist. Right?
Okay.
So they've gone and given a cert saying it's at slab level. There is no slab on the ground.
So basically a fraudulent
fraud,
cert. I mean, okay.
It's absolutely fraud.
And what happens in those instances?
Well, then you have to. So in that instance, the architect left the country. To be honest.
Okay, well, look, that's maybe an extreme example.
Exactly,
fair enough.
But I'm just giving you these.
But I mean, look, that happens in every walk of life. I mean, look at the wonderful auditing companies we have, and then suddenly, a company collapses, or there is, funds that go missing, and then we realize that a very reputable accountancy firm has been approving and auditing the accounts every year. Yeah. I mean, this has happened, this goes back forever, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, it does. But I suppose I've always been a proponent, and I've spoken of this for a long time, and Deirdre Loyne, who you might, a colleague of yours at the bar, I would have spoken with her, and she did a PhD on this. Like, our view was that if you wanted to really improve building control, you needed to have the state doing it. So essentially, like food safety, you don't have an independent person checking your food safety. You have the Food Safety Authority. You've got an independent body, the Health and Safety Authority. These are examples of enforcement where state entity comes in, can enforce, can bring a prosecution, and that was always our view on it. So I still remain of that view, and maybe I'll be proved completely wrong, and hopefully so.
Well, not at all. Martin, in fairness, I think it's very important that we get the perspective from the developer. And we have to say, you are a representative of developers in your legal capacity, but you have a very positive outlook, I have to say, and an impressive outlook. What can developers do? Can developers do more to address our housing crisis, our property crisis? I mean, like, at the end of the day, are they only... You've talked about clients who had greater motivations than profit. And I kind of get that. I do get that. But, should they come together? Should there be kind of some sort of committee where they say, look, let's try and do our bit for society and make a contribution? Yeah, and keep the business ticking over as well. We're not saying it's not a charity. But is there more they could do?
Yeah, but I think in terms of the housing crisis, I think we need to go back to fundamentals. And I'm not dodging your question, but I think we are a post-colonial society. And I've actually spoken to psychologists about this. And that means because we were deprived of proper property rights for so long, because that's what happens when you're colonized, and it's not a slight on anyone, it's just the way it was, or because property rights have not been enforced in a manner that allows you to have surety of tenure, or there's a potential that they could be taken off you at any time. You develop a psychology of wanting to have your own property.
Yes.
And that's and psychologists have said it's a prime example in post-colonial society. So in Ireland, we want to own our own land. We want to own our own house. Everyone wants, and we need to move away from that mentality. So that's a start. So what can we do? We need to start moving that mentality on before we get to the developers.
But also, I mean, in a modern market economy, you need a ready supply of rental accommodation,
Absolutely,
don't you?
Yeah.
Partly for people who aren't ready to buy their own house, partly for people who are coming to the country on a short to medium term basis. And yet, I mean, you see polarized approaches in the media, but it certainly strikes me that there's a huge uncertainty for anybody who's investing in rental property who wants to let it out. You've had the RTB, where there's a very long, drawn-out process. If somebody has a tenant who's not paying, you've had the rental cap. You've had eviction bans. I mean, people need a certain amount of certainty if they're going to invest. And is the certainty there?
Yeah, well, it's not. And I sort just on the developer point. So I don't want to dodge that on it, because I don't want to be like a politician. You asked me a question and I went off on a tangent. So could developers do more? I suppose there's one way. No matter what they do, they're seen as the devil. And that's nearly another symptom with Ireland, where we see anyone who's successful, we begrudge them, as opposed to an American mentality where you go, I want to be that person, I want to be that successful. Sure. Whereas we look at them, we go, oh, well,
I think there's a lot of people in Ireland who want to be that person as well.
But I think they're beginning to learn that you need more stakeholder engagement.
Yes, of course.
And the more stakeholder engagement you have and the more you partner, the less issues that arise. So now you're seeing developers sponsor football teams. You're seeing them out there in the community. You're seeing a lot of that kind of stuff. And they're easy wins. And it's a way of giving back. And also you're listening to the people who come into you. So I think of rather being the person who comes in and just goes, I really don't care what you say. I'm bulldozing that field. I'm just going to put up whatever I want. Engaging with stakeholders has proven that it's the way to go forward. Just going back to your point on I don't think there's certainty. And I mentioned it at the conference that we would have seen a PRS sector. Predominantly you were dealing with investment funds, not vulture funds. And that's a misnomer to call them that. These are the people who have your pension. They have your life assurance. They are, they insure your car. They don't want massive windfalls. They want a steady return over 25 or 30 years. Vulture funds come in, take cheap, flip it very quickly, have a certain percentage return. These people who were coming in to fund the PRS wanted a return over a period of time. Now, the benefit of Ireland as a country is we've always been centre-left or centre-right. We've always been steady as she goes. Americans could come here and know tax won't change that much. Our viewpoint won't change that much. But recently we've seen a swing. And okay, the swing has kind of come back a bit now, but that swing really scared institutional investors. What could happen here if I invest in a property and suddenly I'm going to be subject to rent control beyond what is already there with the rent caps? I'm going to be subject to taxes beyond what I have built into my financial model for the next 20 to 25 years. And this scared them. And we saw a downturn in activity because they're analysing, well, look, if this is the way it goes and suddenly a different leaning government comes in, we don't have the certainty around the investment. And I'm not critiquing any party. I'm just saying this is a significant
there is
factor.
two sides to that, Martin, though, isn't there? I mean, like rent control, maybe is necessary because, for the ordinary punter, I mean, a lot of these, as you say, buy to let, or build to let properties are incredibly expensive.
But
they're incredibly expensive,
but
Mark.
Is that not a vicious circle that basically because you've had these restrictions, so few people are now investing in rental property that it gets more and more expensive simply because there's no...
I mean, I don't know, but this sounds like a pub conversation, but which is great, which is really good. But I mean, traditionally you had somebody who had a second property, or the guards had loads of property. I shouldn't say, but there was small individual people who provided accommodation, for flats in Rathmines, where somebody owned the house and would rent it out, and that was the tradition. And in recent times, that's been replaced by institutional investors who buy up big and then have a lot of control. And sometimes that control isn't in society's interest, Martin. Now, maybe things get done as a result of that. I'm not knocking that. But I mean, there have to be other factors that come into play because not all of them are motivated by altruism, if any. So, I mean, I think there is a happy medium between the two.
And I agree with you. And I think I also agree, like there is definitely a market for that expensive unit for people who live a certain lifestyle and they want that. But like, I think if you want to look at something like rental properties, which I do absolutely agree, we need to move into that. Like the state needs to push on that and have, like, there's no reason why you couldn't make developments attractive to institutional investors, which will only be to a certain segment of the market, but you ensure that they get certain tax breaks or they get something that still incentivizes them to come in and build it, but they're not taking windfall rent out of it. The rent is controlled, but they're getting in some other offset somewhere else from the government. So the government takes a step in to control what they're doing, but when you come into this contract and you agree to do it, you're subject to these following parameters that you won't be putting up rent too much. So, and there's many ways of doing it. Letting it go in a free market is going to end up where you've spoken about. We're going to be in a difficult position. But the people like you mentioned there who have the one additional house that they rent, and in the legal profession, we're lucky. Generally, a lot of our colleagues would have houses like that. And most people I know have divested themselves of those houses. And so I can say that just from speaking to people. And the reasons they give is that the tax, you can't write anything off against the tax. So when you put money into it, a lot of times they can't do anything about that. So it's a significant cost to them.
But so if you invest in improving your property, you can't set it off against your rental income.
I think it was more the mortgage interest relief. You couldn't set that off. I think you can set off some capital stuff, but there was a lot of stuff you couldn't, as I understand it. And then the issues with troublesome tenants were significant, trying to get them out. I know of one colleague, a tenant who was quite good, just fell behind him hard times, owed €10,000 in rent. And a year later, they still hadn't them out of the property. So, that's a lot of money if you're an individual who's...
I think we've all heard those horror stories.
Yeah.
I mean, at the end of the day, small investors letting out houses and then the uncertainty of having a bad tenant and what that does to you. I mean, I think you've explained that really well, Martin.
I mean, it does seem to me that in a property, in a situation like where we are, if somebody falls behind on that, does the state not step in and guarantee the rent for if somebody actually finds that, they lose their job, they're not able to pay? I mean, does that not fall within the housing remit of the local authority, or is that not an option?
Well, they would have to, usually they'd have to have been on some form of support at the moment. And actually, I read a statistic there that 54% of homeowners in Ireland are on some form of state support, or renters in Ireland. And I could be correct.
The HAP, is it?
The HAP, yeah. And all,
Okay.
So usually you have to be on some form of assistance for them to step in. So I suppose where I'm coming from with this is if we go back to my original view of we need to change our mindset. And the only way we're going to change our mindset is if we change security of tenure. Okay, so good renters should have security of tenure for a long time. Like I lived in France. France, you'd have 35 years in an apartment. Germany, the same. And then poor tenants can be dealt with appropriately. Now, I'm not saying you throw someone out because they've missed a rent one, but I'm saying that there's a balance. As you mentioned earlier, there's a balance between the rights of the landlord and the rights of the tenant. And I think that has to be looked at. It can't be a situation where, the tenant can engage in damage to your property and continue to do so, and you're left with no recourse, especially in circumstances where you eventually get them out and they may not have any funds.
Yes.
And you may not have your insurance covered because it was deliberate. It was deliberate damage and it mightn't be covered by what you're doing. So I think there's a balance there. And I think we do have to look at security of tenure. Absolutely. I think we need to look at protection of tenants' rights. My younger brother has lived in America for the last 20 years. He's an American citizen. He's in the same apartment in Los Angeles since he went there 20 years ago. And he sees no reason to move. He likes the community, likes living there, and he has a rent control. There is a rent control that it can only go up by a certain measure. And that's it. He's happy with it. So we need to change our mindset around that.
Martin, I can't believe it. This has been so interesting. We've let time drift away. We're well over the half an hour. Connell is freaking out behind the window here. So we better ask the question, Mark.
Yeah.
Ask the question. This has been brilliant, Martin. It's been really good.
Okay. The final question. Do you have a book or a film you'd like to recommend to our listeners?
It's funny. Just this weekend, I watched the film The Mauritanian. I don't know if you're aware of it. And I'd never heard of it. It came up on Netflix. And The Mauritanian is a movie about a guy called Mohamedou Sali. I might pronounce it wrong. And he was a detainee in Guantanamo for 14 years with no charges. And the movie is about his rendition and then the lawyers who represented him and the lawyers who were prosecuting him, the military lawyers who were prosecuting them, and the conflict between the two.
Is this a drama
it's a
or
true
a
story?
documentary?
True story.
Oh,
well, the movie is a and essentially he was let go after 14 years. But it came up as a suggestion. I watched it, and it was the fundamental is the rule of law.
Fantastic.
How much this woman who's defended him was becoming under abuse, and she's like, he's still entitled to due process. And ultimately, his prosecutor came out and blew the whistle on what had happened, and it came out about the torture and so on. We don't know whether he did or he didn't do it. The movie doesn't tell you. But it was, the fruit of the poison tree. If you've abused someone to the point where they'll confess to anything, you can't use it. So that's what I watched this weekend, and I thought it was quite good.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Martin Cooney, thank you very much for joining us here in the Fifth Court.
Thank you.
The Fifth Court will adjourn until next week.
So that's all from this edition of The Fifth Court. We hope you have enjoyed it. A huge thank you to our guest, partner from Byrne Wallace, Martin Cooney, for coming in to talk to us about the developer's perspective on building issues and development and all that sort of stuff. He was great, Mark.
I found it very interesting, I must admit.
Yeah, really, what a brilliant interview he gave us. Really enjoyed that. Okay, so before we go, I would also like to say a big thank you to our producer, Conal O'Moroyne, and to Lee Brennan of the Dublin South podcast studios for his wonderful work in recording this show. So from me, Peter Leonard.
Myself, Mark Tottenham.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you soon in the Fifth Court.